programme with £500 million last year, the UN Food and Agriculture Organisation with £40 million, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development with over £50 million in their efforts to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition across Africa. We are also assisting countries to respond to the desert locust upsurge in East Africa, which threatens 25 million people with severe food shortages. UK Aid has funded a supercomputer to track and help develop early warning systems, and UK Aid has provided £5 million to the UN's FAO Regional Emergency Appeal.
Thank you. Mr Speaker, in addition to the point made by my honourable friend, will the Secretary of State urge the Commonwealth Development Corporation to avoid investments which involve making, selling or utilising single-use plastic packaging?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I can assure the honourable gentleman that all government departments are closely integrated in the work of both humanitarian aid, economic development and improving our planet. The work of my right honourable friend Lord Goldsmith from the other place means that we are fully integrated in ensuring that economic development is not done at the cost to the environment and the planet.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister. I call the Prime Minister to answer the engagements question from Vicky Foxcroft. Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as we approach the 3rd anniversary this coming Sunday of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, I know that the whole House would wish to join me in sending our heartfelt sympathies and thoughts to the families and friends of the 72 people who lost their lives and to the survivors. Across government, we remain committed to ensuring that such a tragedy can never happen again. Mr Speaker, members from across the House will want to join me in offering our very best wishes to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh on his 99th birthday. And I'm sure, Mr Speaker, the whole House will also want to join me in wishing you, Mr Speaker, a very happy birthday. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues, Mr Speaker, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you. Thank you for all the kind regards. We're going across to Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As a shielded person, I'm grateful to once again contribute to Parliament. Many shielded people have contacted me, worried about government guidance on going for walks. They want a safe hour walk for shielded people, similar to that adopted in many other countries. Will he do that? They also want more transparency on the shielding list with each category named and risks published. Will he provide that? And finally, will he agree to review the furlough scheme so shielded people in the future are not penalised?
Minister.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I can tell the honourable lady that we certainly will be doing as much as we can in the near future to ensure shielded people get guidance about how they can come out of their shielded environment safely in a way that is COVID secure. And on her point about furlough, it's a very important one, and clearly newly shielded people may be asking themselves whether they will be entitled to furlough funds. I've been made aware of the issue very recently. I can assure her that we will be addressing it forthwith.
Thank you, sir. The threatened breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration for Hong Kong is just the latest evidence of China's increasingly overt rejection of the rules of international fair play. The Communist Party of China expresses derision for the West's short-termism and lack of unity, so let's prove them wrong. Would my right honourable friend consider publishing a consultation paper for the development of a long-term strategy for our national and pan-national engagement with China?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, perhaps it would be helpful in advance of any consultation paper if I just set out my own broad position and stress that I am a Sinophile, and I believe that we must continue to work with this great and rising power. But when we have, on climate change or trade or whatever it happens to be, but when we have serious concerns as a country, we must, whether it's over the origins of COVID or the protection of our critical national infrastructure or indeed over what is happening in Hong Kong, then we must feel absolutely free to raise those issues loud and clear with Beijing, and that is what we will continue to do.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister on his comments on Grenfell, a dreadful night, and his comments on the Duke of Edinburgh, and of course his best wishes to you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also say I listened carefully to what the Prime Minister just said on furlough for those newly shielding, and can I welcome that? That has been something we've been concerned about. We'll look at the proposal when it's put on the table, but I'm grateful that he's listened to that and for what he said this morning. The Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, on Monday said that feelings of black and minority ethnic groups about discrimination are founded on a cold reality. I agree with him about that. There have been at least 7 reports into racial inequality in the last 3 years alone, but precious little action. For example, most of the recommendations in the Lamy report into inequality in the criminal justice system have yet to be implemented 3 years after the report was published. Similarly, the long-delayed and damning report by Wendy Williams into the Windrush scandal has yet to be implemented. I spoke last night to black community leaders, and they had a very clear message for the Prime Minister. Implement the reports you've already got. So can the Prime Minister now turbocharge the government's responses and tell us when he'll implement in full the Lamy report and the Windrush recommendations?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, and of course I understand, as I said, I understand the very strong and legitimate feelings of people in this country at the death of George Floyd, and of course I agree that Black Lives Matter, and we are getting on with the implementation, not just of the Lamy report, but also the report into Windrush. For instance, on the Lamy report, for which this government commissioned, and for which I thank the honourable member for Tottenham, we are increasing already the number of black and minority ethnic people in the prison service, as David Lammy recommended. We are increasing the use of body-worn cameras, and we are trying to ensure, amongst other things, that young BME people are not immediately prosecuted as a result of the trouble they find themselves in, and we try to make sure that we give people a chance. But I must stress that on the Lamy report and on all these matters, it is absolutely vital at the same time that we keep our streets safe and that we back our police. And that is what we are going to do.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome what the Prime Minister says about implementing the reports, and obviously we'll hold him to it. He will appreciate that people do notice when recommendations are made and then not implemented, so it's very important that they are implemented in accordance with those reports. Mr. Speaker, the latest report is the Public Health England report on the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. That report concluded that death rates are highest amongst black and Asian ethnic groups. And it went on to say, and this was the important bit, that it's already clear that relevant guidance and key policies should be adapted to mitigate the risk. Already clear. If it is already clear that guidance and policy need to be changed, why has the government not already acted?
Mr. Speaker, not only already clear, but we are already acting. And I can tell him that what we are doing, as a result of the report by Professor Fenton, which again we commissioned, we are looking at the particular exposure of black and minority ethnic groups to coronavirus, and be in no doubt they've been at the forefront of the struggle against coronavirus, whether it's in the NHS or in public transport. 44% of the NHS in London, or London workforce, is black and minority ethnic workers, and that is why what we are doing first and most directly is to ensure that those high contact professions get expanded and targeted testing now. And that's what I've agreed with Dido Harding from NHS Test and Trace. I think that's the first and most practical step we can take as a result of Professor Fenton's report.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Prime Minister, I know, understands the frustration from those most at risk when they see a report like that and they know action is needed. And action is needed now, not in a few weeks or months. So can I ask the Prime Minister to complete, well, perhaps the Prime Minister will indicate whether that's all of the action or whether there's more action. This is a serious issue. We can make progress together. But it is important that it's done swiftly for those most at risk. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to the overall numbers of those that have tragically died from COVID-19, because those overall numbers haunt us. Since last Prime Minister's questions, the government's daily total figure for those that have died from coronavirus has gone past 40,000. The ONS figure, which records cases where coronavirus is on the death certificate, stands at just over 50,000. And the number of excess deaths, which is an awful phrase, stands at over 63,000. These are amongst the highest numbers anywhere in the world. Last week, the Prime Minister said he was proud of the government's record. But there's no pride in those figures, is there?
Mr. Speaker, let me just say that on the death figures for this country, we mourn everyone, and we grieve for them and for their relatives and their friends. But I must also tell him, and he's raised this point repeatedly across the dispatch box, the best scientific evidence and advice is that we must wait until the epidemic has been through its whole cycle in order to draw the relevant international comparisons. And that, I'm afraid, I simply must repeat that point to him. And as for the what this country did to fight the epidemic, I must say I strongly disagree with the way he characterises it. I think it was an astonishing achievement of the NHS to build the Nightingale hospitals. I think it was an astonishing thing that this country came together to drive down, to follow the social distancing rules, in spite of all the doubt that was cast on the advice, to follow those rules, to get the number of deaths down, to get the epidemic under control in the way that we have. And this government has announced a plan on May the 11th to get our country back onto its feet, and that is what we are going to do. We have a plan, we're following it, and we're going to stick to it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it just doesn't wash to say that we can't compare these figures to other countries. Everybody can see those figures and see the disparity, and we need to learn from those other countries. What did they do more quickly than us? What did they do differently to us? Because we can learn those lessons and ensure that the numbers come down. And it's little solace to the families that have lost someone to simply be told this is too early to compare and to learn from other countries. And of course there will be long-term consequences as a result of the government's approach. I want to turn now to another aspect of government policy, and that's school reopening. We all want as many children back into school as soon as it's possible and as soon as it's safe. What that required for that to happen was a robust national plan, consensus among all key stakeholders, and strong leadership from the top. All three are missing. The current arrangements lie in tatters. Parents have lost confidence in the government's approach. Millions of children will miss 6 months' worth of schooling, and inequality will now go up. Several weeks ago, I suggested to the Prime Minister that we set up a national task force so everybody could put their shoulder to the wheel. It's not too late. Will the Prime Minister take me up on this?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I told the House before, I've been in contact with the Right Honourable Gentleman by a modern device called the telephone, in which we've tried to agree a way forward, which he's then seemed to deviate from later on. Last week he was telling the House that it was not yet safe for kids to go back to school. This week he's saying that not enough kids are going back to school. I really think he needs to make up his mind. And since he's so fond of these international comparisons, he should know that there are some countries in the EU, in Europe, where no primary school kids are going back to school. I think, and we are being extremely cautious in our approach. We're following the plan that we set out, and I think that the people of this country will want to follow it. And all the evidence I've 97% of the schools that have submitted data are now seeing kids come back to school. And I think what we would like to hear from the Right Honourable Gentleman is a bit of support for that, and a bit of encouragement to pupils, and perhaps even encouragement to some of his friends in the left-wing trades unions to help get our schools ready.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let's have this out. The Prime Minister and I have never discussed our letter in any phone call. He knows it and I know it. The task force has never been the subject of a conversation between him and me one-to-one or in any other circumstance on the telephone. He knows it, so please drop that. Secondly, he mentions other countries. Plenty of other comparable countries are getting their children back to school. Wales is an example. Across Europe, there are other examples. We're the outlier on this. And it's no good, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister flailing around trying to blame others.
Order. We need to get through with lots of other members, so if we can listen to the question, then I certainly want to hear the answers. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I was saying it's no good the Prime Minister flailing around trying to blame others. A month ago today, he made the announcement about schools without consulting relevant parties, without warning about the dates, and without any scientific backing for his proposal. It's time he took responsibility for his own failures. This mess was completely avoidable. The consequences are stark. The Children's Commissioner has warned of a deepening education disadvantage gap. And she spoke yesterday, her words, the Children's Commissioner, an emerging picture which doesn't give confidence that there's a strategic plan. She called for the government to scale up their response. It must have occurred to the government that space would be a problem, that there would be a need for temporary accommodation and classrooms. They built the Nightingale hospitals. Why are they only starting on schools now?
Mr. Speaker, he still can't work out whether he's saying schools are not safe enough or whether we should be going back more quickly. I mean, he can't have it both ways, Mr. Speaker. It's one brief one day, another brief the next. I understand how the legal profession works, but what the public want to have is some consistency, Mr. Speaker. And what I hope that he will agree with me is that it's a good thing that we've now got 37% of kids in Year 6 in our primary schools coming back. That is increasing the whole time. And what I think the message that I think that teachers want to hear across the country is that all parliamentarians in this House of Commons support the return of kids to school. And furthermore, that they are encouraging kids to come back to school because it is safe. Will he now say that?
Keir Starmer.
I want as many children to go back to school as possible, as soon as possible, as quickly as possible when it's safe. I've been saying that like a broken record for weeks on end. I know the Prime Minister's got rehearsed attack lines, but he should look at what I wrote from this letter and what I've been saying consistently. Mr. Speaker, one way in which the government could help those worst affected would be to extend the national voucher scheme. Because child poverty numbers are so high in this country, 1.3 million children in low-income families rely on these vouchers. They mean children who can't go to school because of coronavirus restrictions still get free meals. The Labour government in Wales has said it will continue to fund these meals through the summer. Yesterday, the Education Secretary said that won't be the case in England. That's just wrong, and it will lead to further inequality. So can I urge the Prime Minister to reconsider on this point?
Prime Minister.
What I can tell the right honourable gentleman is, of course, we don't normally continue with free school meals over the summer holidays, but we are also, of course, and I'm sure that's right, we're also, of course, aware of the particular difficulties faced by vulnerable families, and that's why we're announcing a further £63 million of local welfare assistance to be used by local authorities at their discretion to help the most vulnerable families, Mr. Speaker. This government has put its arms round the people of this country throughout this crisis and has done its absolute best, to help. And I may say it is not helped by the wobbling and tergiversation of the Labour Party and the gentleman opposite. First last week he says it's not safe. This week he says we're not going fast enough. We protected the NHS, Mr. Speaker. We provided huge numbers of ventilated beds. We're now getting the disease under control, but we will do it in a cautious and contingent way. And today I will be announcing further measures to open up our society and to unlock our society, but only because of the huge efforts and the sacrifice that this country has made. We're sticking to our plan of May the 11th. And we're sticking to our plan. It's a plan that is working and will continue to work, Mr. Speaker, with or without the assistance of the right honourable gentleman opposite.
Alan Mack. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Britain's new Advanced Research Projects Agency is vital to securing our status as a science and technology superpower, particularly as we recover from coronavirus. Can my right honourable friend commit to protecting its funding and its independence so there are no obstacles to it delivering transformational breakthroughs from clean energy to new vaccines?
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Yes, and I thank my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. We will be having an advanced research projects agency funded to the tune of £800 million, and it will be tasked with supporting really revolutionary breakthroughs in this country, because it was the UK, from splitting the atom to the jet engine to the internet, that has led the world in scientific research, and under this government we intend to continue.
We're now heading up into Scotland to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on Grenfell, of course, on the birthday of the Duke of Edinburgh, and yourself. And, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told the Liaison Committee, "I do not actually read the scientific papers." It is no wonder then, Mr. Speaker, that it took the UK so long to act on quarantine measures. The Prime Minister's Scientific Advisory Group weren't even asked for advice on this significant policy. This has been a complete shambles. Too little, too late. We cannot risk ignoring the experts once again. Can the Prime Minister confirm what scientific papers he has read on the 2-metre social distance rule?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I disagree with him. I've read a huge amount about a disease that affects our entire nation. I've read many papers actually on the social distancing rule, and it's a very interesting point. And I think members across the House of Commons will want to understand that I believe that those measures, the 2-metre rule, needs now to be kept under review. As we drive this disease down, as we get the incidence down, working together, I want to make sure that we keep that 2-metre rule under constant review, because as the right honourable gentleman I think indicates, there is all sorts of scientific advice about that particular matter.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we know that the Cabinet has discussed reducing the 2-metre social distancing rule, but that's not the experts' advice right now. SAGE reported that being exposed to the virus for 6 seconds at 1 metre is the same as being exposed for 1 minute at 2 metres. That, Mr. Speaker, is a significant increase in risk. And the last time Professor Whitty was allowed to attend the daily press briefing, he stressed that the 2-metre rule was going to be necessary for as long as the pandemic continues. People are losing confidence in this government. A U-turn on schools, a shambolic rollout of quarantine measures, and now looking to reduce the 2-metre rule far too soon. Will the Prime Minister continue to ignore the experts, or will he start following the advice of those who've actually read the scientific papers?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, the people of this country are overwhelmingly following the guidance that this government gives. And tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, the House will be hearing a bit more about what's happened with NHS Test and Trace, and they will find an extraordinary degree of natural compliance, natural understanding by the British people, in spite of all the obscurantism and the myth-making that we've heard from the parties opposite. And I can tell the right honourable gentleman that there are all sorts of views about the 2-metre rule. He's absolutely correct in what he says about the SAGE advice, but clearly, as the incidence of the disease comes down, as I think members of SAGE would confirm, the statistical likelihood of being infected, no matter how close or far you are from somebody who may or may not have coronavirus, goes down.
Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Allowing zoos such as Africa Alive near Lowestoft to reopen from 15th June is very good news, as it provides them with a realistic chance of survival. Would the Prime Minister give full consideration to allowing beer gardens to also reopen from 15th June, as the feedback which I'm receiving is that many pubs are now facing the unpalatable an unwanted prospect of having to make staff redundant.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much, because he's absolutely right. We want to reopen hospitality as quickly as we possibly can. The House will remember that according to the roadmap, we were going to open outdoor hospitality no earlier than July the 4th. That is still the plan. We are sticking to our plan. And so guidance is now being developed for such hospitality. What we don't want to see is a roiling bacchanalian mass of people that can spread the disease. So it's very important that people understand the continuing risks that this country faces.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
The Prime Minister will be aware that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has today published the guidelines for the special payment scheme for severely injured victims linked to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister will also know that this House passed legislation which excludes those injured by their own hand. But the innocent victims have not yet been able to benefit from this scheme, not least because of the actions of Sinn Féin, who are blocking the next steps to implementation. Will the Prime Minister and his government now commit to do all that they can to move this matter forward so that our most vulnerable of innocent victims can receive this pension?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I think this scheme provides a fair, balanced and proportionate way of helping all those who suffered most during the Troubles, and it's very important that Sinn Féin, along with all other parties, allow the scheme to go forward as soon as possible.
Ria Miller.
Mr. Speaker, many peaceful protests have been held across the country against racism following the appalling events in the US, including in my own constituency yesterday. Can I commend my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for recognising the significance of these events, and as well as scrutinising the health impact of C19 on ethnic minority groups, can he look again, using the race disparity audit, for any persistent and systemic racism in all government departments, from the treatment of BAME people in the judicial system through to how we teach children about these issues in our education system?
Minister.
Well, I thank her, and I completely agree with the need for all political leaders to promote these issues, to recognise how important they are in people's hearts, and we will continue. I'm very proud of what I did as Mayor to encourage the promotion of young BAME officers in our Metropolitan Police. We had a system to move them up. I want to see that kind of activity across the government of this country. It's the right way forward for the UK.
Returning to Scotland with Kirsty Blackman. Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, the response from the US President to the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement has been horrendous. Can the Prime Minister confirm to me if he still believes Trump has many, many good qualities? And if so, what are they?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I renew what I have said many times, but it's important for the House to hear it again. Yes, Black Lives Matter, and yes, the death of George Floyd was absolutely appalling. And as for the qualities of Mr. Trump, let me say he has, amongst many other things, he is President of the United States, which is our most important ally in the world today. And whatever people may say about it, whatever those on the left may say about it, the United States is a bastion of peace and freedom, and has been for most of my lifetime.
Found the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, I hope you'll allow me to ask the Prime Minister also to welcome the birthday of the Primate of England, the 2007 Yorkshireman of the Year, the Archbishop of York, who's just laying down his crozier after 14 years of service. His great words that we can share the glories, the struggles, the joys and the pains of this country. Remembering that John Sentamu was tortured in Uganda and served in Tulse Hill, Stepney, Birmingham, as well as York, and was a critical advisor to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Can I put it to my right honourable friend that if in the period of 8 years there are 8 interrogations of a bishop, each time John Sentamu, we've got more to learn about making the colour of one's skin as important as the colour of one's eyes or the colour of one's hair, something you may notice but doesn't tell you any more about them.
Minister.
Well, I join him warmly in paying tribute to the Archbishop of York as he lays down his crozier. He and I correspond very often. I take his advice and very sincerely, and I had no idea that today was such a distinguished birthday, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, under suspicionless stop and search powers, which this government is expanding, a black person is 47 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. 47 times. On too many occasions, stop and search seems to mean being black is enough to be suspected of being a criminal. So will the Prime Minister abolish suspicionless stop and search powers and end the pain and injustice they wreak on so many people in Britain's black and minority communities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's very important that stop and search is carried out sensitively in accordance with the law. It has made a great difference to the way it happens that we now have body-worn cameras, but I must say I do think that it can be a very Section 60 powers can be very important in fighting violent crime, and I'm afraid that what has been happening in London with knife crime has been completely unacceptable, and I do believe that stop and search, amongst many other things, can be a very important utensil of fighting knife crime. It does work. It worked for us when I was running London, and it must work now. And I'm not saying it's the whole answer. He's right. It's not the whole answer, but it's part of the mix.
We're now heading up to the County Palatine of Lancashire with Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hospitality and tourism businesses on the Fylde Coast are concerned about their path to long-term recovery and the infrastructure needed to support that. Centrally to this locally is the M55 Link Road, a project which was fully funded and had an issue with some funding allocations. Can the Prime Minister put his weight behind this and help me secure the £5.7 million needed to complete the shovel-ready project?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that we will unite and level up with infrastructure projects across our country, and I congratulate him in his lobbying for this particular scheme, and I can tell him that last year we put £31 million for the Preston Western Distributor Scheme, which is a new dual carriageway that will reduce congestion in Preston and directly lead to the creation of over 3,000 houses and over 500 jobs. And as for further expansion of the M55, he will have to wait, but there will be further announcements in due course.
We're now heading up into Scotland with Stuart Malcolm MacDonald. Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Even before the pandemic began, it was clear that the UK has one of the most manifestly inadequate systems of statutory sick pay in the world. We are the second from the bottom in European terms, and it continues to shun millions of workers who are low earners, work in the gig economy, or are self-employed. So as we come back from the crisis in economic terms and make the workplace better, well, the Prime Minister agreed to work with those of us in the opposition to see a system fit for the 21st century that can meet people's needs.
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and we will make sure that those who do not have, yes, of course, statutory sick pay is an important part of the way we tackle the problems of self-isolation and all the issues that are faced by people facing coronavirus. But people also receive additional funds. I think anybody looking impartially at what we're doing to support the people of this country throughout this epidemic will concede that the UK has done more than virtually any other country on earth to look after the people of this country, whether through the furloughing scheme or the bounce-back loans or anything else. And listening to him just now, I've also pledged that we are going to put in gigabit broadband across the whole of the UK so that he can be heard more clearly in future.
Heading up to the border of Manchester and Lancashire with Mark Logan.
Prime Minister, we've seen much disinformation about the R value in Bolton and the North West. If we have increasingly up-to-date local data, would the Prime Minister then agree with me that correspondingly greater confidence will be given to Boltonians in reopening our businesses, schools and places of worship?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that's why I am encouraged by NHS Test and Trace and the progress that it is making, and with the help of the Joint Biosecurity Centre, we're able now to identify hotspots, to do whack-a-mole and to stamp out on outbreaks of the epidemic where they occur.
Returning to Scotland with Kenny McCaskill. Kenny McCaskill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. East Lothian prides itself on its food and drink sector, which is gravely threatened by reduced standards in animal welfare and production. The government failed to enshrine protections in the Agriculture Bill. Earlier this week, ministers equivocated on this issue. Will the Prime Minister now take this opportunity to be clear today that high standards will be protected, a Food Standards Commission will be established, and that we won't face chlorinated chicken on our table, along with Kentucky Fried Medicine in our hospitals?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only will we protect animal welfare standards, but we will be able, on leaving the EU as we have, we will be able to increase our animal welfare standards. We will be able to ban treatment of farrowing sows that is currently legal in the EU. We will be able to ban the shipment of live animals, which we currently cannot ban in the UK. We will be able to go further, and I hope, by the way, that he supports it, and I hope he'll tell all his friends in the SNP, is it? I hope he'll tell all his friends in the SNP that that's one of the reasons why their plan to take Scotland back into the EU will be completely contrary to the instincts of the British people.
Mr. Speaker, due to COVID, we're facing a unique economic challenge. Can I urge the Prime Minister to respond with a major package of infrastructure investment to create jobs and level up the whole country, including turbocharging the rollout of gigabit broadband, upgrading the Manchester to Sheffield line, and finally building the full Mottram bypass? The people of Glossop have been promised this by politicians for over 50 years. We'll even let him call it the Boris bypass. Let's please just get it built.
And he could use his bike. Come on, Prime Minister.
OK, well, thank you so much. And my honourable friend, I can confirm briefly to my honourable friend that we are indeed committed under the road investment strategy published last year to building a bypass around Mottram, and I look forward to being there to see it done.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents tell me they've lost trust in the government as they're confused by mixed messaging around public health measures, angry that Dominic Cummings seems to have been let off the hook, but they're particularly worried about local jobs and livelihoods due to inadequate support schemes, lack of crisis funding for Luton Council, illogical quarantine impacting Luton Airport. All of this has been on your watch, Prime Minister. How can my constituents feel confident on the proposed next steps for easing lockdown when your government has fallen short so far?
Prime Minister.
Because I think the British public, with their overwhelming common sense, have ignored some of the propaganda that we've been hearing from the party opposite about our advice. They've ignored the negativity and the attempts to confuse, and they are overwhelmingly following advice. And indeed, they are complying with NHS Test and Trace, which is the way forward, which will enable us to defeat this virus both locally and nationally.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pre-COVID, the Prime Minister has made a firm commitment to reach into some of the most deprived areas and level up the country. This is needed now more than ever. Will he make a firm commitment and recommit to Whitmarines, Chapel Ash, Penfield and the rest of Wolverhampton so they won't just survive, they will thrive?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly will. I congratulate my honourable friend on the way he represents Wolverhampton and the many campaigns that he fights for that great city. And I can tell him that, just as for starters, that Wolverhampton will benefit from around 217 million of the growth deal funding across the Black Country, which aims to create 5,000 jobs, 1,400 new homes and 310 million in public and private investment, just for starters.
Final question, Olivia.
And many happy returns, Mr. Speaker. Today they say that we are free just to be only to be chained in poverty. Figures, not my words, the words of Bob Marley in 1973. Figures from the Trussell Trust show an 89% increase in emergency food parcels across the UK in April compared to the same month last year. People are struggling and they need help now. Will the Prime Minister meet with the Chancellor, charities and local government leaders to discuss a much-needed funding boost for local welfare assistance schemes in England?
Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right. This country is going through a very difficult crisis, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and of course it's put many families to great hardship. I think the government has done a huge amount to look after families across the country. We put, as she knows, £3.2 billion more into local government. And I announced earlier on today, just now, that we're also putting another £63 million into extra welfare support for particularly disadvantaged families to help with meals throughout the summer period. But she's entirely right. We face a huge economic problem. That's why we need to get moving, get this country going forward together, and work as parliamentarians and politicians to communicate to the public jointly what we're doing.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Thank you.